Is it okay to dim the lights again? Okay. Well, welcome back, everyone. I have to tell you, yesterday it made me a little uneasy standing up here talking to all of you. And I know that sounds silly because, I'm a high school teacher and I do this for a living, but as a high school teacher, I'm just not used to people actually listening to me this way. All the eye contact was making me very uncomfortable.
Would you like me to take my cell phone out?
Well, I was going to suggest that. People often say, make sure you turn your cell phones off. But if you would actually, while I'm talking, take your cell phone out and take selfies, and that would make me feel right at home. It would be really good. All right. So as mentioned yesterday, I want to save about a half hour, 40 minutes or thereabouts for a conversation with all of you to get your thoughts, your feelings, your questions. And as I stressed yesterday, I do want to bring us to a place where we can look forward, right? Which is a place I think we have to get to. So just by way of reminder, yesterday we essentially began our presentation together looking at Luther's hideous tract, right, concerning the Jews and their lies, in which Luther advocated for all of these things. I think the way I put it to you yesterday, all of these things that the Nazis would do so many centuries later, right, and more, I think I said. But I had made the point to you that looking at Martin Luther's concerning the Jews and their lies does nothing, really, to help us answer our guiding question. That question, again, being, why the Jews, right? Where does this hatred come from? But the point in having us start here was simply just to illustrate or to show that this contemporary anti-Semitism that we find in our own communities today and was so infamously illustrated by the Nazi movement is, of course, very old, right, and runs very deep in European life. So then we came to this question, right? I had suggested that really to kind of get at why this is happening, we need to first understand where it starts, right? And then we can kind of, as I said yesterday, kind of leverage the tools of the historian to analyze the historical context of the period to try to make sense as to why it's happening. And I had made the case that these potential answers to that question don't really work, in that these are not classic examples of what we would call today anti-Semitism. And so then I put it to you that we begin to see, I said, some of the clearest, most obvious expressions of a deep, bitter, caustic, I think I used the word, anti-Judaism with the rise of Christianity. So we then began to trace this. And so we came back to the time of Christ, and we saw that he lived in this rather diverse community. But then some years after his life, this catastrophe befalls this community upon their rebellion from Rome. And in the wake of that rebellion, we said there would be essentially only two Jewish groups who would survive, right? These two. And this is where the tension begins to mount, right? Where we said this community is desperate to legitimize its belief in Christ. And in order to do so, it was necessary for them to delegitimize the views of those who don't. And this is when, of course, the Gospels were written. And so Gospels like Matthew and others have this profound anti-Pharisaic bias in them. we find these lines, which again is typical of the first century. The vehemence of this language is typical of the time. And then we find as we go just a little bit more forward in time, when the Gospel of John is being written, we find this same kind of language being now directed towards the Jews. And we then, from here, looked at the emergence of what we call the dual myth, right? The first of which was this belief developed by early Christians that the Jews were responsible for the death of Christ, known, again, in academic circles as the myth of deicide. You know, I was thinking about this last night, by the way, as I was lying in my bed in that sort of state between sleep and being awake, my mind still sort of churning over what we had talked about. And I remembered that I had a conversation with a Holocaust survivor last summer. We had lunch together here in Atlanta. As a Romanian survivor. And we were talking about many things, but among them his high school years. And he said to me, I'll never forget this, he said, Brendan, do you know what they called me in high school? He said, they called me Christ killer. That's what he said. That was his nickname in high school. Christ killer. And of course, it's coming out of this long-standing teaching within the Christian community that the Jews, again, as we stressed yesterday, are collectively responsible for the death of Christ. The second of these two myths was this idea that the covenant had been broken and now forged with a new people, known as the myth of supersession, sometimes referred to as replacement theology. And God has now forged a new covenant with Christians. We then took a peek into the patristic period when we read that homily by St. John Chrysostom to get a sense of what kinds of things were being preached about Jews from Christian leaders. And again, Chrysostom is not some rogue priest. He is the head of Christianity, right? And if we had time, we could look at many writings, homilies that have survived from this period, which essentially express the same thing. Chrysostom's comments, of course, are deeply rooted in both the teachings of deicide and supersession. You'll remember, of course, he's quoting those very lines and passages that we looked at together yesterday, especially that line from the Gospel of Matthew, where Matthew, the writers have the crowd shouting back, of course, his blood be on us and on our children, right? Chrysostom is quoting this line to justify these views. In what little time then we had left yesterday, we just kind of took a peek again into the Middle Ages. And we looked at this front facade of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. You'll see this. It's still there, of course. Right. She's going to Paris tomorrow. When you go, you'll walk over to Notre Dame, right? I'm sure, and there is a barrier around it, but the barrier is low enough where you can still see these statues. I think it's meant to reopen in about a year and a half, but they've tried not to block the view. Thankfully, I suppose, at least this particular part of the cathedral had been rescued from the fire so they can reconstruct it. But we talked about these two statues, right? You'll remember of both ecclesia in synagoga here and here. And we talked about how these cathedrals were built with the intention of teaching, right? And this is clearly teaching that central belief that the covenant had been broken with Jews. Right, the crown has now fallen off of their head. It's here at her feet. And a new covenant now has been formed here with Christianity. I had also said to you that the placement of these statues is really, really important. Do you remember me saying that? That, again, they're not like some 200 feet in the air where you can kind of hardly make them out, but they're very prominently shown, suggesting that this teaching of supersession is really, really important. And if that's true, right, then certainly we would expect to find them elsewhere, and of course we do. They are all over the place. We find them in cathedrals all over Europe. Here in Bamberg, you can see them here in a cross as well. This is their representation here in Strasbourg. You see them more clearly here. My students often comment on the posture of ecclesia and synagogue. This is clearly intentional, right? The posture of ecclesia, of course, is one of being triumphant and confident, and the posture of synagogue is that of being humiliated, downtrodden, defeated. There are sometimes some slight variations on the theme, but they're all meant to express the same idea. Very often you see the staff held by synagogue broken twice. Not always, but oftentimes. And again, the broken staff is meant to imply that kind of broken power or broken authority. But the primary reason why it's shown to be broken twice is because, do you remember yesterday we talked about how in the wake of that Jewish rebellion from Rome, the Romans had destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, leaving only what today we call the Western Wall still standing. That was actually the second time, as I'm sure you know, the second time that that temple had been destroyed. And of course, for Christian theologians, the destruction of the temple was a symbol of God's rejection. And so very often you see it broken twice, as it were. In most cases in these representations, when you see ecclesia here in synagogue shown alongside the crucifixion, in these cases, you see the crown just falling here in midair off the head of synagogue. And that is because, in accordance with this teaching of supersession, this was the moment when the Jews killed Christ, when God said, enough. That was the moment when the covenant had been broken and reforged with a new people. And so when they're, not always, but often when they're shown alongside the crucifixion, you see the crown here just falling, as it were. You see the crown falling here. Can you tell, by the way, what synagogue is holding in her hand there? Sorry? Yes, exactly. It's the decapitated head of a goat. Exactly. Here. What's up with the goat? Well, there's a line in the Gospels, Gospel of John, where Jesus references what Christians often refer to as the second coming, where Christ essentially tells his disciples that I will return, and he says, when I return, he says, I will separate the sheep from the goats, right? And the sheep will go to heaven, and the goats will go to hell. And I think ever since that line was written, goats have always gotten a bad rap, right? They've often been associated with sin, with evil, with the devil. Very often you see goat imagery in medieval witchcraft iconography, right? And so the image of the decapitated goat, I suppose, lost to us in today's world. But look, if we were living in the 13th century and you were gazing upon this stained glass window, I mean, could you imagine if this was here? In your stained glass window in your church, you would know exactly what that meant. It's meant to imply a demonic worship. This goat has been sacrificed to Satan. You see the goat here as well. In this image, you can see the hand of God coming down and crowning ecclesia. She's holding a church, right? Again, she represents the church. And look what the hand of God is doing here to synagogue. Right, violently plunging that medieval broadsword straight through her skull, violently knocking the crown off of her head as Jesus breathes his last breath. The goat imagery again. Synagogue. I mean, this is a 14-foot tall painting at a very small chapel in southern Germany. It's enormous. It's well south of Munich. Oh, here. Yeah, this is synagogue here, but you're asking about this here. It's Eve. Mm-hmm. In this representation of Ecclesian synagogue, it's like a reenactment of a medieval jousting tournament, right? Ecclesia is riding this stallion, piercing synagogue with her lance. Can you tell, by the way, what synagogue is riding? Yeah, it's a pig. We'll come back to the pig. Again, the hand of God coming down and crowning Ecclesia, and that bloodied medieval lance violently knocking the crown off of synagogue. The goat imagery again. This is a baptismal font from a basilica just outside of London, and this is chiseled here onto the side of the marbled baptismal font. I mean, it hardly needs an interpretation, right? But you have Ecclesia shown in the full bloom of life, in sunlight, and synagogue, this dying, moribund, withered plant in darkness. It's in Spain, of course. Ecclesia shown as this kind of young virginal woman, in synagogue, this, decrepit elderly woman. I'm always reminded of this. I was presenting at Congregation Or Hadash in Sandy Springs, a local synagogue community, some years ago. And I shared this image with the audience, exclusively a Jewish audience, and there was this lovely elderly woman seated like right here in the front. And she looked at this image, she goes, I take offense at that, she said. Not because it's anti-Jewish per se, but because it's like ageist. You know what I mean? And she said to everybody, why does the old woman have to be the Jews? And I thought, yeah, there you go. In the Middle Ages, we also see the emergence of rumors, lies, told by Christians about Jews that would go, we would say today, viral. Among the most popular were two ideas known as the host desecration and the blood libel. The host desecration is this hideous lie told about Jews that they are stealing consecrated hosts or otherwise getting their hands on it and desecrating it, such as you see this Jewish man doing here. He is stabbing the bread, and blood is miraculously pouring out of the bread. And you find this accusation being leveled against Jews in communities across the whole of Europe. Here's just one example. This is from the German town of Passau from the 15th century, where wood cuts and prints like these are broadsheets, gained widespread circulation throughout Europe, furthering these accusations. In it, it was said that in this particular town of Passau, there was a young Christian man who had stolen the consecrated bread, the host, from his tabernacle at his church. You can see him looking around. And he then takes it to the Jews, can you see, who give him what for it? Money. We'll come back to that. The Jews then take the consecrated host and bring it to their synagogue, where, again, they begin desecrating it. And again, they're stabbing the bread, and it was said, according to the legend, that blood miraculously began to pour out of the bread. The Jews then take what remains of the host and they throw it into a fire. And again, according to the accounts, when the remaining pieces of bread was thrown into the fire, the Christ child appeared here amidst the flames. Angels descended upon the scene with trumpets blaring, thereby alerting the local authorities, who arrested the Jews and committed medieval justice. Historians have, through the years, uncovered thousands of documents that attest to these atrocities, where Jews will be massacred upon this accusation of host desecration. I just happened to come across this a few years back when I was on their website looking for a poster for my classroom. Can you imagine? So I called them, and I waited and waited and waited until I got through to whoever I needed to speak with at whatever level was necessary. And to her credit, she sat with me for some time on the phone, and she had admitted to me that she had no idea what this poster was, what it was saying. And so I told her. It took a long time to tell. And again, to their credit, they have removed it from their website. Small steps. But let me come to this question, right? Why are Jews being accused of this? Right? I think we can readily dismiss the notion that Jews are actually doing this. I mean, look, there's, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a belief in the Catholic community that was held throughout the whole of Christianity prior to the Reformation, as you know, which taught this idea known as transubstantiation, right, where Catholics believe that through the Eucharistic prayer at Mass, the substance of the bread, we say, is transformed into the body of Christ. That's I'll admit to you, I'll confess to you, confession's a very Catholic thing. That's a hard one for me to wrap my head around. Do you know what I mean? As a theological concept, that's a really challenging idea and very challenging for many Catholics. much more so for Jews, you understand. My point is to say that Jews would not be doing this because they would not have recognized Jesus to be present in the bread. They would therefore not be motivated to be doing this. But, I mean, why are they doing this? Well, I mean, look at the imagery. In just about all of the accounts that come down to us, it is said that Jews are doing this to the bread. What are they doing to it? They're crucifying it, exactly. They're not, it is said in the accounts, they're not like taking the bread and shredding it or stomping on it with their feet or throwing it into a river. No, they're stabbing it. This is what Christians are saying. And of course, we can surmise that this accusation tells us far more about Christian prejudice at the time than it does about Jewish practice, right? Christians understood Jews to be Christ killers in their very essence. And it's important to note that this accusation doesn't emerge until after 1215. And there's a reason for that. And that is because in 1215, the Catholic Church held a very important council where they gathered the whole of the bishops to Rome in a little neighborhood called Lateran. It was known as the Fourth Lateran Council. And it was in this council when the church affirmed and announced transubstantiation. And so once the church stands up to the whole of Christianity and says, Christ is present in the bread, well, my goodness, wouldn't Jews love to get their hands on that, they say. And so thus you begin to see this accusation, as I say, kind of go viral. The blood libel is this grotesque and popular, widespread accusation which said that Jews were kidnapping Christian children. Here you can see this boy being boiled in a cauldron, being prepared for a kind of ritual sacrifice. And the accusation says that Jews are kidnapping Christian children and draining their blood and using that blood by either drinking it or ingesting it directly, or, as was often said, being used as an ingredient in their Passover meal. One of the first known accusations of this blood libel came from the English town of Norwich, this very small little village where in the 1200s there was this young boy there named William who one day went missing. And William's body was found some days later hacked to death in a ditch. And in response, the Christian community of this village of Norwich had risen in a righteous anger and accused the Jews of a kind of ritual murder. According to accounts, there were about 7 Jewish families who lived here in the town of Norwich at the time, very small little community. And the retribution was awful. But when this accusation is made, it goes viral, as I say. And you see subsequent accusations being populated in communities throughout the whole of Christendom, going all the way into the 19th century. One of the most well-known cases comes from the Italian city of Trent from the 15th century, where in this case, not unlike Norwich, there was a young boy here named Simon who one day went missing, and his body was also found having been hacked to death, killed, stabbed. And of course, the Jews of Trent were accused again of a kind of ritual murder. And the main reason why this story of Simon becomes so well known is because it happened to coincide with the invention of the printing press. And then you see broadsheets like this one telling the story of Simon of Trent being, widely distributed. And here you can see the depiction of Simon being held forcibly against his will while Jews cut into him, drain his blood, collecting that blood here in this bowl. Today, in Trent, there's this lovely kind of Renaissance building that sits right in the city center. That building today that sits on the Piazza Salvadori was built right at that time when the Jewish community of Trent was accused of this ritual murder. In that community, several Jewish leaders were sentenced to death, the rest were expelled, their homes were ransacked and destroyed, and there was a synagogue that stood here on the ground where this building now stands. The synagogue was destroyed. Anything of value, of course, was looted. And this building was built in its place. And on the side of this building here, you can see these two stone medallions that still tell the story of this ritual murder. The medallion on the left shows Simon, again, being ritually murdered by Jews. You can see the large bowl there collecting his blood. And the other medallion shows Simon now reigning on high. We say in the Catholic Church, he was canonized. He became a saint, Saint Simon of Trent, because the church deemed him to be a martyr for the faith, that he was killed in defense of the faith. It's important, I think, to point out, just as a footnote, that he is no longer a saint today. He has been decanonized, we say. And of course, this is because the church recognizes today that Simon was not ritually murdered by Jews. In fact, Jews were not doing this, right? And so he has been, as we say, decanonized. But still, I mean, look at this. Look at these people lining up at Maison Dumont, this beautiful coffee shop. And I wonder, do they know what this is? They should, right? This is another depiction of Simon. You can see him strapped here to this table with all these multiple stab wounds across his body. It says, both in German and in French, this infant named Simon, age 2, was murdered by the Jews Holy Thursday, 1475. It says this portrait essentially sits at the door of the entrance gate of Frankfurt on Main. This is a sort of a wood carving image of Simon of Trent that hung at the entrance gate of Frankfurt. You may remember that all of these cities in the Middle Ages, be it Frankfurt or Berlin or Munich or Paris or Rome, Florence, they all had walls around them. If you go to these cities, you can still see remnants of these old medieval walls. And they all had entrance gates. And those entranceways were often places for billboards and advertisements. And this was a very prominently hung billboard that hung at the entrance gate of Frankfurt for years. But it's less the image of Simon here that I wanted to show you, and it's more the image of what sits underneath him. It's this one. I said we'd come back to the pig. In this grotesque depiction of Jews, You have a pig here that's shown central to the image, and the pig, of course, is eating its own feces. Pigs will do that. You have a Jewish man here suckling the pig from underneath. A second Jewish man eating the pig's feces directly from the source. You have a third Jewish man straddling the pig here, holding up the tail to effect this eating. You have a fourth Jewish man here with goat horns coming out of his head. We understand the symbolism there. And you have a fifth Jewish man in the back leading a goat into the proceedings again, presumably for that sort of satanic ritual sacrifice. This grotesque depiction, meant, of course, to dehumanize, was actually ubiquitous and popular. It was a very popular way of depicting Jews in the Middle Ages. And it had become so widespread that it had its own name, known as the Judensau, the Jewish pig. And like with Ecclesia and Synagoga, there were some variations on the theme, but again, they all convey the same message, as it were. That's right. It's a mockery of that, isn't it? This is, as it says, St. Mary's Church in Wittenberg. Who was from Wittenberg again? Yes, of course, Martin Luther. This was not the church, it was said, where he posted his 95 Theses. That's just down the street if you've been to Wittenberg. But this was the church that he said Mass in every day. He was daily communicant. It sits almost directly across the street from where his office was at the University of Wittenberg. And so he would walk every day over to St. Mary's, and here, in the corner of that church, is yet again another image of the Judensau, which looks like this. It's quite weathered and worn a bit, but knowing what it is, we can make it out. Luther actually commented on this in one of his writings. He said this about it. You can see here it says rabbi, right? I want to come back to this image of Simon of Trent. This is something of a Where's Waldo kind of question, but is there something in this image that has been in most of the images that we've been looking at this evening? Do you see it? Not the bowl. That's a good suggestion, though. Something else. Underneath the table. No, something else. The satchel of money. It is, we'll come back to that though, but yet it's still something else. Do you see it there? At that same Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the Catholic Church passed a mandate. And when the church passed such mandates, you would appreciate how in the Middle Ages there was no separation between church and state, right? And so it became law. And this mandate required Jews to wear a distinguishing badge on their clothing. We'll see this again. The purpose of which, of course, was to identify and to isolate. Right? These medieval towns tended to be very crowded communities, and they wanted, of course, to be able to ascertain, to know, to recognize who may be Jewish in this town. And so here you see this Jewish man with the badge on the back of his cloak. In some communities, they found these badges, which, by the way, was left to local magistrates to determine what size the badge would be, where it needed to be shown, what color it needed to be, what it may look like. But in some communities, they found the badge to be not identifiable enough. And so, in addition to, or the badge, they were required to wear these oddly shaped, pointed hats, as you see there and here. The Black Death, which was said to have killed off some 1/3 of Europe's population, in many communities, Jews, of course, were accused of causing it intentionally. It was often said that Jews were poisoning the wells, or in some instances, emitting into the air a kind of poison. And in communities such as in Strasbourg here, Jews were rounded up and burned alive upon this accusation. Never mind the fact that Jews were dying in similar percentages. This didn't matter, of course. The Crusades were a brutal time for Jews. When the Crusades began in 1096, Christians, can you imagine, mostly, walked to Jerusalem from places like Paris. And of course, as you make your way from Western Europe, the Franks, in this direction, you follow the rivers, right? Towns, villages, and communities were all built on rivers, and so they're leapfrogging from one town and one village to the next, making their way out to the Middle East. And so they're following the Rhine and the Danube rivers and other tributaries. And in doing so, they would come upon communities very often that had small Jewish populations. And there are myriad historical accounts that have survived which attest to how these Christian crusaders gave them the choice of conversion or death. If you look at the map here, all of these towns and villages and communities are towns and villages and communities where these massacres had occurred. I mean, it's everywhere. This is, as it says, an illumination taken from a French Bible, which illustrates these Crusader massacres. And so you can see these Crusaders here decapitating Jews. See the hat? This was the primary means of execution that was used. Bodies then dumped into the Rhine and Danube rivers, while Jesus looks down from on high and blesses these actions, the symbol of his hand of blessing. If you've ever wondered where that long-standing stereotype comes from that often associates Jews with greed, with money, in large part it comes from the story of Judas, who, as you know, was willing to betray the Son of God for what? 30 pieces of silver, it was said. In the Christian imagination, Judas becomes the quintessential Jew, one who was, again, willing to betray God for money. His greed is so great. And so very often in the Middle Ages, when you see Jews being depicted, they're not always, but very often shown, whether it's within context or not, shown holding a money bag, a symbol of their greed. Do you remember yesterday when I had to go back out to my car to retrieve it, when I read that hideous tract by Luther? And he says, of course, burn their homes, burn their synagogues. Do you remember he says towards the end of that, he says, look, why don't we just do what everyone else has done? Such as France, Spain, and Bohemia, and just drive them from our lands for all time, he said. If you look at the map here, all of these territories and regions shown in yellow are territories and regions where Jews had been forcibly expelled by Christian authorities through the ages. By the way, look at all those arrows pointing to Poland. You see that? This is primarily why Poland would become ground zero, we might say, for the Holocaust. Because that is overwhelmingly so where the bulk of Europe's Jewish population had lived in the modern age. And that's largely because of these centuries of forced expulsions. You may remember me saying that the Jewish population of Germany at the time of the Nazi rise was less than 1%. This is why, right? But I want to point out as well, this arrow here pointing down from southern Germany, pointing towards what city is right there? The most beautiful city in the world, maybe. Yes. Anybody been to Venice? Yeah. You can probably see where this is going. Right. In the 15th century, there was a flood of German Jewish refugees forcibly expelled from Bavaria, from cities like Regensburg and elsewhere. And they came here to Venice, seeking haven, seeking refuge. And interestingly, the Doge, that is to say the elected leader of Venice, allowed them to stay at a time when they were being forcibly expelled elsewhere. The Doge allowed the Jews to stay here in Venice, under one condition, however, that they be contained. And so the Doge took a look at the map of Venice together with his advisors for an appropriate place to put them. And there was this little neighborhood in northwest Venice, that had recently been abandoned. And the Doge said, perfect, put them there. It has 2 bridges, one on the north and southern ends of this little city block. We can erect, he said, cast iron gates on these bridges. We can allow Jews to go about Venice wearing the hat and the badge during the day, but at nightfall, they will have to be back into their neighborhood. We will lock these gates and monitor them. Well, the reason why this particular area was a good fit is because, again, it had been recently abandoned because it was an old foundry complex. A foundry, as you know, is like a factory that melts iron ore. You've seen images of this before, and it pours, it looks like molten lava. It pours into like casts, and it makes cannonballs or swords or cannons themselves, whatever it was they were making. Well, that process is very polluting. And the people of Venice demanded that the foundry be dismantled and rebuilt on the mainland, which they did, leaving this little neighborhood abandoned, and said, the Doge said, put them there in the foundry. Well, foundry is, of course, an English word. They did not speak English there, they spoke Italian. The Italian word for foundry, of course, is getto. Right, getto. And if you speak German, you know that there's no real J sound in German. And so for the German Jews, forced to live in the ghetto, it became, of course, for them, the ghetto. By the way, this is the origin of this word ghetto in terms of meaning like an impoverished neighborhood. And moreover, this policy of forced ghettoization of Jews here in Venice would become a policy adopted in cities all over Christian Europe. They would all, in due time, erect their own ghettos, often with walls around them, isolating Jews. It is, by the way, still one of the Jewish communities in Venice. Those of you who've been to Venice, did you go to the ghetto? Yeah, it's extraordinary to walk this neighborhood and to, as we say, bear witness to this history. Did you go through some of the synagogues there? It's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah, I think they have, if memory serves, 4 separate synagogues just there in this little neighborhood. But it's beautiful. The next time you go to Venice, make a trip. It's a very short walk over to the ghetto. So we've come full circle. We started this presentation together with Luther, and then we went back and traced where that hatred comes from. So we looked at how it developed and how it manifested itself in a variety of ways. I think I have, very often, I don't know if you had this experience, perhaps you did, but very often in my presentations, when I read that tract by Luther, again, where he's like, burn their homes, burn their synagogues, people are quite shocked by that. I think maybe if I read that to you now, we might be a little less shocked, right? We would come to understand how Luther is a product of his generation, a product of his time, and what, in fact, he's saying was being done everywhere, But think of this. As dark and as terrifying and as troubling and as murderous as this history had become that we'd been tracing together, there was never a deliberate or systematic attempt to exterminate all of them until our modern age. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is because there's one last piece to this story that we haven't yet talked about. One last insidious idea that once layered on top of the centuries that we've been tracing together, it will come to make a place like Auschwitz possible. Not inevitable, do you understand? History is never inevitable. History is always the result of a collection of choices, right? And those choices can always be different. So, what was this last piece to this story, and how might it make a place like Auschwitz possible? Well, take a look at this. This photograph was taken not too far from here in a town called Shreveport, Louisiana. As it says, 1909, the second annual baby contest. What you're looking at is a crowd of families all dressed in their Sunday best. And they've brought their children here to be entered into a contest where, upon entrance into this building, these children will be inspected by a staff of medical professionals to determine, I am not making this up, to determine the quality of their whiteness These children were inspected from head to toe, put through various measurements, and if deserving, they were given a medallion. I have a goodly inheritance. And they were given this too. I mean, just look at this. They were given a certificate, Louisiana State Fair, Shreveport, Louisiana, a sound mind and a sound body. I mean, look at this. This certifies that. They'd write in your name. And then this. You were given a grade, an average percent that quantified the quality of your whiteness. In the Better Babies contest held under the auspices of the Louisiana State Fair and Women's Home Companion, signed here by all of these officials and given the official state seal of the state of Louisiana. I mean, if this was something that you had received a high grade on, your parents would frame it and hang it somewhere prominently in the home. But what if you didn't? Well, there he is there, the winner of the second annual Better Babies contest. I mean, you look at an image like this, and it's the old proverbial, like, you just don't know whether to laugh or cry. Well, as you are no doubt aware, this sort of thing was going on in Nazi Germany as well in the 1930s. In this photograph taken outside Berlin, you have these two twin boys being inspected once again by a medical professional to determine the quality of what they call their Aryanness. He is measuring their eye color by comparing the color of their eyes with those found here in this marbled placard. The idea being, as you know, the fairer the eye, the more Aryan one was deemed to be. And they measured your hair color as well. Same principle, right? The fairer the hair, the more Aryan one was deemed to be. And they actually measured, too, the circumference of your skull. They developed this instrument that looked like this because it was believed that the Aryan race had a kind of predetermined skull size. And the closer the size your skull came to it, the more Aryan you were deemed to be. Skull measurements. Well, take a look at this. Vacher Lapouge was a 19th century French biologist, and he's living during all these years of Better Baby contests and skull measurements and all the like, and he wrote these words some 2 years before Hitler was born, and look at what he said. I am convinced, he says, not like, I think maybe, perhaps, no. He says, I am convinced that in the next century, people will slaughter each other by the millions because of a degree or two difference in their cephalic index. Right? And the last sentimentalist will be able to witness the most massive extermination of peoples. I mean, it is a stunning prediction. I mean, in effect, he's predicting the Holocaust decades before the Nazis even come to power in Germany. And it kind of begs the question, like, what enabled him to make this prediction? Well, I would argue, you know, like, short of being some sort of Nostradamus or having a crystal ball, which he did not have, I would argue that what enabled Lapouge to make this terrifying prediction was because he saw something, he recognized something clearly that evidently most did not. And that is, he recognized, as you can all readily see, that it wasn't really people's skull sizes that was being measured, but what was really being measured was a person's value, a person's worth. And once he saw that, I believe, he's able to make this prediction easily. Right? I mean, if we're honest, and I mean, if we are honest with ourselves, I mean, what do we tend to do with those things we don't value? We bully, we humiliate, we grow indifferent towards, we get rid of. Conversely, those things that we do value, we love, we embrace, we encourage, we accept. This is what we do. Well, forgive me for showing you this, but I think we need to look at exactly what Lepouge is getting at here. This photograph was taken in a small town called Marion, just about 30 minutes north of Indianapolis, Indiana, right around the same time as all of this, in the 1930s. We know, all of us know, that lynchings was an epidemic in this country. And I mean, look at this. Look at this. Here. Holding hands. Smiling. Do you remember, we have seen those smiling faces before, right? Well, I had said to you a few moments ago that there was one last piece to this story that we hadn't yet talked about. And this is it. What is this? Of course. What is this an image of? Yes, racism. Yes, white supremacy, racism. You know, the concept of race is a relatively new one. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but it more or less comes out of the biological revolutions of the 19th century, Darwin and all of that. And just to make sure we understand this concept, prior to the ideas of race, so say during the time of Martin Luther, it was commonly understood that the entire human family could trace its origins back to like one original pair. In a Judeo-Christian context, this of course would be Adam and Eve, from which the human family had been kind of like generated. And this was the understanding that had gained widespread acceptance for millennia. But then in the 1800s, there was a new model put forth by the scientific community which suggested no, there was not one original pair, but in fact there were many. And each of these original pairs would generate its own offspring. That is the concept of race. And this would allow, for the first time, human beings to say two things that they could not say before. And again, you can all see where this is going. First, of course, it allows human beings to say, again for the first time, we are different. we are actually different kinds of human beings. But then, of course, secondly, that being the concept of race, secondly, it allows human beings to say that we are not just different, but of course what? Yeah, we are superior. And in fact, your inferiority represents a kind of nefarious threat to my superiority. That's when the concept of race becomes racism. And you know, it should be pointed out that this model here has been entirely debunked by modern science. We have an exponentially greater understanding of human genetics today than they did back then. And in fact, we know that the human family is essentially 99% genetically identical, right? Nonetheless, racism endures. And I know I don't need to remind any of us in this room how dangerous this model can be. But just to be sure, take a look at this. Karl Pearson, in the early 20th century, was a very prominent, highly regarded thinker, intellectual, philosopher, teacher, professor at many of England's finest universities. And he was living, do you remember, he was living at that time when the British Empire had spanned the globe, that they had colonized huge portions of the world. And of course, the jewel in their crown of their colonial empire was India. And throughout their period of colonialism in India, British authorities forced Indian peasants to stop growing food and instead to grow indigo. As you know, a colorant, a dye, a plant used to dye cloth to feed the insatiable appetites of the factories in Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool. And as a direct result of this British policy, millions, and I mean millions, of Indian peasants died of what? Yes, of starvation. The London Times was doing a kind of expose on this tragedy, and they were doing this sort of lengthy investigation. And for that, they kind of interviewed Karl Pearson for his take, his thoughts on this tragedy. And when asked about the deaths of these millions of Indian peasants, this is what he said. When asked about the deaths of these millions of Indian peasants, he calls it progress. That is how dangerous racism is. And when you layer this way of thinking over centuries of Christian anti-Judaism, this is what you get. You know, more or less since we started this conversation together, there has been something of an elephant in the room. There's been a kind of question kind of hanging in the ether, as it were, that we have to confront, right? I mean, if we didn't, we would be guilty of a tremendous avoidance. And it's a very uncomfortable question in many ways, but you can all see that this question has been staring us in the face. And that question is this: given this history that we've been tracing together yesterday and again this evening, does Christianity bear responsibility for the Holocaust? I mean, again, just raising a question like that in a place like this. But you can see it. That question has been in our face. Well, in the years following the Holocaust, Catholic leaders around the world have been urging Christian communities to take up this question and answer it. And of course, Christian communities have been quite reluctant to do so. But some years ago, the Catholic Church gave permission, as it were, to the United States Council of Catholic Bishops, which is in essence the committee that oversees the Catholic Church here in the United States, to take up this question and answer it. And so they established a committee which they called the Bishops' Committee for Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. It's a committee of about 15 bishops, and they met periodically, off and on, over the course of a time, and in time they crafted a statement, a response to this question, and sent it to the Vatican for approval. That approval was given, and they were then given permission to kind of release this statement to the world. And I want to share with you what they said. This is what they said. So they say, Christian anti-Judaism, yes, did lay the groundwork for racial, genocidal anti-Semitism by stigmatizing not only Judaism but Jews themselves for opprobrium and contempt. Nazi theories tragically found fertile soil in which to grow into an unprecedented attempt at genocide. Christian teaching of anti-Judaism, that would be the teachings of deicide, that the Jews are Christ killers, and the teachings of supersession, that the covenant had been broken, the Jews are now cursed and cast. So Christian teaching of anti-Judaism is, they say, a necessary cause to consider in explaining the development and success of Nazi anti-Semitism, but, they say, not a sufficient cause. And this, I think, is sort of the thesis of the statement, where they say, to account for the Holocaust, one must acknowledge the historical role of Christian anti-Judaism. But, they say, Christian anti-Judaism cannot alone account for the Holocaust. So in response to this question, does Christianity bear responsibility for the Holocaust? The church is here. The Catholic Church's response is yes, but there's more. Well, what else was there? Well, this, racism, right? Which they call semi-scientific racial theories, because again, as we've noted, these theories are not scientific. Racism, it should be noted, did not really come out of Christian belief, right? In fact, many Christians rejected those ideas. So they say semi-scientific racial theories and specific historical, ideological, economic, and social realities within Germany. What would that be? Well, the loss of World War I, the collapse of their governments, the collapse of their democracy, the rise of a totalitarian dictator, the Great Depression, the traumas of the Great Depression, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things, they say, are necessary to grapple with in understanding this tragedy. Can I show you something hopeful? I want to share with you an image that I came across some years ago, and when I saw it, it stopped me in my tracks and has since rather like stuck like a burr in my mental socks. It's this one here. Do y'all know who that is by chance? Do y'all know who that is? So this is a previous pope. Currently in the Catholic Church, we have a pope named Pope Francis. Prior to him was Pope Benedict, who recently passed. And then prior to him was this gentleman, Pope John Paul II, now Saint John Paul II. Where is he? The Wailing Wall. Yeah, he's at the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. He came here against the wishes of his doctors. He was dying of the debilitating effects of Parkinson's, and his doctors feared that he wouldn't make the voyage. But he insisted on going because, as he explained to his handlers, he wanted to stand at this place and touch those sacred stones and ask for forgiveness. He understood, as we all do intuitively, that whenever you have a relationship that's broken, be it a relationship with a parent, a child, a spouse, a friend, a loved one, the only way that that relationship can be mended, and we know the only way, is that there has to be some measure of forgiveness. You know, his name is not John Paul II. These are titles that popes assume. His name was Karol Wojtyła, and he grew up in a small town called Wadowice, which is just about a 30-minute drive from another Polish village called Oswiecim, or what the Germans called Auschwitz. As a younger man in his 20s, he saw the Holocaust happening all around him. There were young men from his boyhood soccer team, he was a goalie, who he saw hauled off on those cattle car trains. And when he became a priest, later the Bishop of Krakow, and then later elevated to the position of Pope, he made it central to his life as a clergyman to do whatever he could to reverse this terrible history that we've been tracing together, and to seek a new path forward between Christians and Jews. And you know, he did, as is the tradition, when you go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, you write a prayer down on a scrap of paper. That's right. You fold it as many times as you can and you stuff it into the crevices, as you can see, in the wall here. This is a thing. He did that. People then pulled his prayer out because they wanted to see what it said, right? And he then kind of formally released it. And this is what his prayer had said. Notice the last thing he says there. What does he call the Jews? People of the covenant. Who's this guy? Yes, this is Pope Francis. He's the current Pope of the Catholic Church. He came here, Pope Francis did, to the United States not that long ago. And about a year before he came, he met with his handlers to kind of put together an appropriate itinerary for his visit. And they decided that he would visit Philadelphia, New York, and what was the other one? Washington. Yeah, Washington. So New York, Washington, and Philadelphia. And he said to his team, he said, look, when I'm over there, I want to visit a Catholic college. And they said, well, you'll be in Washington. You've got to visit Georgetown. It's like the preeminent Catholic university in America, next to Notre Dame, of course. And he said, no, if you know anything about this Pope, he's not really into preeminence. And he said maybe something smaller. And so they found this lovely Catholic college in Philadelphia called St. Joseph's. And it kind of fit with his itinerary. So he said, perfect, let's go there. And so they called the president of St. Joseph's College on this random Wednesday afternoon, and I've heard the story told. Like, the president picks up the phone, he's like, hello, and they said, this is the Vatican. The Pope wants to come visit your college, and he's like, yeah, right. Who is this, right? Make a long story short, he called an emergency meeting of the Board of Trustees. They all came rushing in, of course, expecting the worst. He closed the doors and said, the Pope is coming. And they all said, yeah, right, what are you talking about, right? Make a long story short, they decided at that meeting that they needed to somehow mark the occasion, right? This would be perhaps the most important thing that might ever happen to this college. And so they went big. They hired a local Philadelphia area sculptor, like to sculpt something appropriate that could sit on their campus as a kind of permanent remembrance of this moment. And he wasn't quite sure what to make, and so he met with the president of the college, he met with members of the board, he met with the Archbishop of Philadelphia, others, to kind of brainstorm ideas. He came up with a design and finished his work just weeks before the Pope's arrival and brought it over on a big crane and set it down on this pedestal in the middle of their campus for the big unveiling, right? The name of the statue? Synagoga and Ecclesia. This is the statue here. Isn't that extraordinary? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You can see they're both crowned. We understand the symbolism there. And that is because in 1965, at another Catholic council known as the Second Vatican Council, the Catholic Church released a landmark statement in Latin called Nostra Aetate, where the church stood up and announced to the world, we got this wrong. And announced that they were officially rejecting these teachings of deicide and supersession. The Jews, they say, should never have been blamed for the death of Christ. And moreover, the covenant had never been broken. In fact, we Christians have been grafted onto that olive tree. We are both covenanted, the church says. Hence, they're both crowned. And they're like symmetrical representations of each other, right? They're like mirrored representations, suggesting that kind of symmetry, balance. They're almost twins, as it were. And of course, they're both holding their sacred text, but what are they doing? Yeah, they're learning from one another. Can you imagine? Here's the bronze version that was brought to their campus. You can see it says Synagoga and Ecclesia in our time, in reference to this Latin statement, Nostra Aetate, which means in our time. You know, when I saw that statue for the first time, I had this like...
90% connected to MacBook Pro 2.
I had this insistence, like it just came over me, that we had to have a copy of this statue on our campus at Marist.
Judaism and Christianity are two sister faiths, but there have been many challenging times over the years, many tensions and many unfortunate incidents.
I've been teaching the history of the Holocaust here at Marist now for nearly 30 years. And in that time, my students and I always find that there's something of a paradox in studying the history of the Holocaust, where the more one seems to study this history, the more one examines the totality of this evil. In fact, the less one understands. It may be the only class at Marist where this paradox exists. And when we come to that place, that crossroads, when we become stuck, both my students and I, at that kind of impasse, I find as a teacher that the thing that gives us forward motion is art.
I kind of grew up, thinking I would be an artist with the intention of that, learning to draw at an early age. My mother was pretty encouraging with that. I remember sitting on the floor with my mom, at a young age, 5, 6, 7 years old, and going through books of Renaissance art and Greek art, looking at Michelangelo, and truly at that age being in awe of the virtuosity. I think it was 2014, I was contacted by St. Joseph's University. They had come across my work, someone had recommended me, and they let me know that they were trying to create a monument based off of the two subjects that are often found on medieval architecture, synagoga and ecclesia, representing church and synagogue. And their hope to reinterpret those two symbols, which were historically unequal. Christianity, church, was always presented as victorious and crowned, whereas synagoga, Judaism, was depicted as defeated, downtrodden, blindfolded, and kind of enemies of God. And St. Joseph's University wanted to reinterpret that symbol because 50 years prior to that was the the announcement from the Second Vatican Council of Nostra Aetate.
Nostra Aetate, I mean, it's remarkable. It is one of the greatest documents, of our lifetime. It essentially looks back at the past 2,000 years of Catholic-Jewish relations and says, we made some mistakes here.
Nostra Aetate and this whole tradition of opening up to other religions and acknowledging what they bring to us as a positive versus our differences as a negative, I think becomes really important in young people's development.
I often tell people that one of the most upbeat stories in recent decades is the qualitative changes to Jewish-Catholic relationships. And that is really due to Nostra Aetate. And so this sculpture kind of celebrating the path forward for Jewish-Catholic relationships is just so important.
In the fall of 2015, I came across an article in the New York Times which talked about Pope Francis, who had recently visited a college there in Philadelphia called St. Joseph's. And he had come to bless a statue made by a local Philadelphia area sculptor named Joshua Kaufman. And when I saw the statue for the first time in that article, I was profoundly struck by it. And so I called him. And I asked him if he would consider creating an addition for our campus here at Marist. And he said he would.
It's not an easy thing to acquire a sculpture like this. There's a lot that goes into it. So to go through all those hoops to make it happen, it's clear that they're devoted to it. And that's humbling for me, it's inspiring. I marched into Father Rowland's office the following morning and pitched the idea to him of bringing the statue to our campus.
And we began to talk further about it, and he explained to me its meaning. And so when I heard all of that and thought about its significance and its relevance to what we're doing here at Marist School, I couldn't help but say yes, and enthusiastically so.
History teacher, I want my students to understand that history is never inevitable. Instead, history is always the result of a collection of choices, and those choices can always be different. We have to believe that. And so I want my students to believe that it is within them to apply all of their learning, their innate sympathy to the project of promoting understanding among different peoples, religions, and cultures to, in effect, create a better world. And so I think the statue speaks to that key central value. This is where I often feel like I wish we had a charter bus right over here. We could get on the bus and head over to see it. But isn't it just extraordinary? I mean, we all know, don't we, the power of imagery, especially for our young students, not just at Marist, but all over. And, I don't know, I often find myself discouraged these days when I look at the news or hear of the vitriol in our politics. It's easy sometimes to become discouraged, and for me, this image is just, it just gives me hope. It sits right outside my classroom.
How big is it?
Well, I was asked to write the plaque for it, and so I wrote, Synagogue and Ecclesia in Our Time, which is the official name of the statue. We at Marist School bear witness to the call God makes to Jews and Christians to embrace the virtues of solidarity and compassion. May this space awaken in our hearts the desire to apply our learning, insight, and innate sympathy to promote understanding among different peoples, religions, and cultures. Dedicated October 13th, 2021, on the 56th anniversary of the Declaration of Nostra Aetate. Yeah. I mean, it's just, I don't know, as I say, it gives me hope. It should be stressed that the Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Lutheran, and many other Christian denominations and communities have made similar statements and have rejected the history of Christian anti-Judaism. So I had promised to leave some time for questions, comments, thoughts, and so I do want to ask, like, what do you think? Like, what is on your mind? And again, it doesn't have to be questions or just statements or thoughts or comments or whatever. Do we have a mic to pass around? Great, thank you. I had said I would leave more time, but I've run past our time a little bit. We still have another 20 minutes or thereabouts. I'll take it. Do I need to turn on? Is it? Oh, yep. Wow. What do we think? Yes, please. Will you pass that over?
Microphone. So what's a good solution
That's
for...
not working.
Oh, no, I can
There,
be
now it's
louder.
on. Now it's on.
What's a good solution for the remaining art that's so anti-Semitic in Europe?
It's a great question. Let me show you this. Not that long ago, petitions were circulated here in Paris to have these statues, I'll take it, to have these statues removed for the very reasons you're noting. And petitions had gained, a great many signatures, and they were then presented to sort of the keepers of the cathedral. But of course, as you can see, the decision was made to keep them there. The primary reason, as it was explained in their view, was to preserve the historical authenticity of the building. But they, as a kind of compromise, they erected these signs. Do you see them? Here, directly underneath each of the statues. And these signs essentially say two things in two languages. They explain what these statues are. They explain the teaching of supersession at the time. They explain their symbolism. But then they also make clear that the Catholic Church, this is a Catholic cathedral, has rejected these teachings in the Second Vatican Council in 1965 as part of Nostra Aetate. So for some, it doesn't go far enough, right? But this is what they've done. There's also a sign underneath the Judensau image in Wittenberg. It's a similar sign that explains what this statue of the Judensau is and what the imagery represents, and offers a comment of rejection of this dehumanizing image. But it's still there, which is still upsetting to people. Yeah.
I'm really curious about Martin Luther and his role in all of this. I think we've all
Yeah.
all that, how did the people like him
Yeah.
and other people, how did they come to a point of peace
Mm.
the pamphlet that he wrote?
Mm-hmm.
And why didn't we know about that? I never heard about that until you talked to that yesterday.
Well, so the question, sorry, I turned it off. I apologize. When I was holding it, I struck the off button. The question was asked about Martin Luther. What are we to make of all of this? And you point out how it had never been taught to you. The same is true for me. I mean, I'm a product of Catholic education. I attended St. Pius here locally in Atlanta, though I don't tell my students that. It's a big rival of Marist. I went on to the University of Notre Dame, majored in history, went on to get a master's degree in Catholic theology, blah, blah, blah. And I only mention this to say that nowhere was any of this ever taught to me. Anywhere. And I'd been to Notre Dame, I had seen these statues and had no idea what they meant. Until when I was hired to teach at Marist, I was hired to teach world history, and I had just, about a week before my hiring, I had just been given a copy of Elie Wiesel's Night by my rector, Father Thomas King, at Notre Dame. This is just prior to my graduation, and I had never read Night before. I had studied a little bit of the Holocaust as a history major. And if you've read Night, of course, it's a very short read. It's one of those books that, of course, leaves you with more questions than answers, right? And I was very eager to bring some of these questions to my students at Marist. But when you teach world history to a 9th grade high school class, you have 11 minutes to teach the Holocaust, right? And so that summer, after my first year, I wrote a very formal proposal and submitted it to then headmaster Mike Mayer at Marist, seeking permission to create a seminar class on the Holocaust, right? And to make a long story short, it took some prodding, but he agreed. And the class was set to be on the following year's curriculum, so before I started my 3rd year. And it became one of those things like, be careful what you ask for, right? Because now I had to create a whole class on a subject matter that I myself really hadn't studied all that much. And as part of my preparation, it was only then, I came across a book at Emory University. I had gone to do research called The Ideology of Death, written by an author named Weiss. And there was a whole chapter in there, a very long, lengthy chapter on the history of Christian anti-Judaism. And I thought, what is this? And he talked at length about this imagery and what it meant. And I felt this overwhelming sadness that this history is unknown, largely within the Catholic Church. And I felt this determination that that was going to change. And so I am often asked, like, why do I do this? Like, why? People often ask me if I'm Jewish, right? Brendan Michael Murphy, probably not. Okay. Why did you create a seminar class on the Holocaust at a Catholic school? It's often asked. And there are many reasons for that, but one of the primary reasons is because of what we've been talking about today and yesterday. That, look, there's real reason to be hopeful with a statement like Nostra Aetate. Do you know what I mean? But that statement is essentially meaningless unless you understand the history behind it that made the statement necessary. Right? We cannot appreciate this statue that I just shared with you on our campus unless you understand the history behind it. And I'm happy to say that, that our students at Marist know it. I mean, they all kind of take my class. And we spend, as I said earlier, like 2 weeks tracing the history that we did in 2 days. So I share this despair. I mean, my wife is Lutheran, and when we were dating, long before we got married, we met at Marist. She came as a counselor, and she came to one of my lectures, and she'd never heard it either. And I saw her face. I was often looking at her face in attendance, and it was just one of like shock when I was reading Luther's comments. And she too felt like, and asked me directly, like, why haven't I learned this before? But we can understand, and I alluded to this earlier, that there was nothing unique, different, or special about Luther's anti-Semitism. He's a product of his time. And again, all of these things he's advocating for had been going on all over Europe. Calvin talked about the same things. John Calvin never had a statement quite as vehement as Luther's, but he expressed teachings of deicide and supersession as well in his teachings. Yes?
Is this pamphlet, booklet that he wrote,
Yeah.
is that obscure?
Is that, whoa, hello. Is that something that if you studied Martin Luther, you would just come across, or is it something you would have to dig for? I mean, I'm really concerned about.
It's something that you'd have to dig for, to be sure.
I got on Wikipedia today, saw the whole thing.
It's right there, Wikipedia, sure.
Well, but prior to Wikipedia, you know, I'm
Yes.
kind of concerned about how my father-in-law came to be a Martin Luther scholar and wrote books and things. I can't equate what I know of him and him knowing about this pamphlet. I can't make the two
Yeah.
come together.
You know, it's this, tracing this history does that to you. Do you know what I mean? Like it forces us as Christians, those of us who identify as Christian, it forces us to confront this history in a way that for some is too uncomfortable. And look, it's one thing for me to offer a lecture like this in communities across Atlanta, right? That's one thing. But what matters more is that people come. And you guys came. And you're willing to confront this history. And you're willing to be uncomfortable, right? I mean, look, I talk about this with my students all the time. It's like, for me, in many ways, this extraordinary statue of Ecclesia and Synagoga speaks really eloquently to the important difference between schooling and education. Did we talk about this? No. Schooling is the piling on of names, dates, and facts, right? It's Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and Parlez-vous français, and quadratic equations, and all of that. It's instruction, schooling, important to be sure, but just a part of one's education. Education comes from the Latin word educere, which means to bring out of, right? As in, if properly nurtured, one can educe a flower from a seed, right? And so, in the original meaning of the word, one's education is the bringing out of who God intends us to be. And that process can very often be uneasy. It can be uncomfortable. I have given these presentations in communities where people have stood up and walked out of protest. Because it's too uncomfortable. But I'm glad they came. You know, I wish they would have stayed, to be sure. But people need to hear this story.
So, it's on. So, it's been amazing education the last 2 days. But where do we go from here? Because I think this is just a drip from a
faucet, and I would like to find the well.
Mm-hmm. Where do we go from here? Let me share an anecdote with you. Two anecdotes. We all remember the terrible massacre at Tree of Life Synagogue in Philadelphia, right? A mass shooting. And on that Monday morning after the weekend, I was asked to say a few words over our PA system at Marist. At Marist, every morning we begin the day with prayer. And it's a faculty member or a student or a member of the staff who will deliver a short little prayer at the beginning of the day over the PA system. And my principal called me on Sunday and asked if I would just make some remarks about this. And so I did. And I said, I had mentioned to you yesterday that I run this Piece by Piece program, right? Where we bring Christians, Jews, and Muslims together. So we partnered with the Weber School. And I just sort of made this remark over the PA system following my prayer. I said, we have developed a relationship with Weber School up the street from Marist, and if anyone would like to offer them encouragement. Look, these are students who every day arrive on their campus and drive past a squad car and a policeman. We don't have that at Marist. And it wasn't just on that Monday, you understand. That squad car is there every morning. And so I said, if anybody wants to, sort of offer some words of encouragement, just come by my classroom. I had some papers out, and we can sign it. And, well, Marist has a student body of just over 1,200 students, 7th through 12th grade. Just over 900 students came through my classroom in the course of that day. And we had to, move it to our campus ministry office and lay out all these papers. And people just wrote these little one-liners. We love you. Like little 7th graders, can you imagine? And said, and signed it. Things like that. And I then collected all of these pages and brought them over to Weber that afternoon. And kind of gave them to my contact there, Barbara Rosenblit, who was in the middle of her class, and the principal let me go see her class, and so we interrupted her class, and I gave her the stack of papers, and she was like, what is this? And she began to read it, and it was unbelievably emotional. Well, they decided to put up all these papers at their school entrance. So the students come in, they walk down a long hallway, so it would be like out here on the walls. And it just was this incredibly important moment of an expression of support and solidarity. And I share this with you because I think it gets at this question, what do we do now? Well, in part, education is meant to, part of this process of becoming who we're intended to be is to be people of action, to be people who respond, right? And so my hope is that, and I think this is the reason why I do this, teach these classes, is because I hope that learning this history produces in us a kind of sensitivity where when we hear of people distributing anti-Semitic leaflets in our neighborhoods in Dunwoody and Sandy Springs, we will reach out to those in our communities who are Jewish to say, you know what, I reject this, and I just want you to know that I do so, and that I love you and I support you. Jewish people in Atlanta need to hear that when these pamphlets are distributed like that. They need to hear us, again, those of us who identify as Christian, they need to hear from their neighbors to stand up and say, we reject this, and we won't tolerate it. I taught in this adult education class at Marist just last week. It was a 3-part series, 3 evenings, and it was like an audience. We had about 180 people. Half were Christian, half were Jewish, more or less. It was very interesting dialogue. And there was a woman, a Jewish woman, who said, "I'm terrified. I am scared." And the other, and I'm not saying she spoke for the entire Atlanta Jewish community, but others who were there were like shaking their heads yes. And it's incumbent upon us who live in this community to be, as we say, upstanders. Do you know what I mean? Like to speak out against hate. And so what do we do next? What are the next steps? It's that. It's responding to moments in our communities when we recognize hatred and speaking out against it and letting those who are targeted by it to let them know that they're supported. There are other things too. I gave this presentation at the Marcus Jewish Community Center in early January, I think? And they raised the same question. Like, what do we do now? What do we do with this now? And so I met with their directors about 2 weeks later and put it to them that let's have an evening of Catholic-Jewish dialogue. Let's bring Catholics and Jews together, set up round tables in a big room, arrange it so that at each round table are Jews and Catholics, and let's just get some wine, okay, some kosher wine, get some cheese, and talk about life. It doesn't have to be deep questions related to theology, but questions that relate to our experience as Jews and as Christians. And so we're doing that in April. And I believe either this week or next, the sign up for it is going to go live on their website. And I think it's going to be, a lovely evening. But, yeah. Yes, please. Yep, thank you. Okay, it's on.
Hello, can you hear me? When our next door neighbor invited us to come to this class, for the life of me, I did not expect I'm gonna end up crying. But as a daughter of Holocaust survivor, as a mother of Jewish kids and Jewish grandkids, grandmother of Jewish grandkids, I want to thank you from all my heart for what you're doing. And I'm not scared for our future. Because place where we came from, Soviet Union, what we experienced there is because we are Jews. Like both of us couldn't get to college because we were Jews. We were not accepted. He had to go to different city, and I had to go to night school. But that's just, besides people telling us that, oh, you're such a nice person, even so you're a Jew, and stuff like that. America is way better. I mean, we are like way above what's happening in the other parts of the world. But it's still here. In our synagogue where we go to Shabbat services, we always have an armed guard at the doors right now. Because, you hear stories, you just want to be on the safe side. We always have our doors locked during daytime, open only if somebody, it's still there somewhere, but to me it's a part of life. I'm very impressed with what you're teaching, what you're showing. This sculpture gives me incredible hope for a better future. Our both daughters married to Catholics. And our granddaughter had, this last Saturday, had a bat mitzvah. And our in-laws, relatives, cousins, brother, everybody came and celebrating with her like it's own holiday. I was so worried that people will not know what we're talking about, but it was wonderful, wonderful show of love to each other. And I hope that's how we're going to go. That's how this country going to keep going. And again, thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Anyone else? Good. Well, can I just close with this then? We're just getting, it's already 10 after 8, sorry. Very often, I'm invited to speak at communities because of word of mouth, right? I reached out to, back in the fall, about 40 different Catholic parishes throughout the Archdiocese, and I asked them, I introduced myself and asked if I could teach this class in their parishes, right, to teach the history behind the statue and the hope that it gives. And I heard back from none of them. I sent a follow-up email, no response. And so I went to the Archbishop, and I pushed, and he agreed to meet with me. And I invited several prominent Jewish leaders from Atlanta to meet as well with him. And he was lovely, lovely. He was so excited about the potential for this class being taught at Catholic parishes. He was fully in support of it. And so he's going to start making some phone calls, right, on my behalf to make sure that I'm invited in to speak. And I don't mean to suggest that parishes didn't respond to me because of anti-Semitism, right? It's just that they don't know this history. And they don't know why it would be necessary to teach it, right? And so I mention this only to say that, again, very often I'm only invited into communities when someone says to the leader of that community, I think we need to hear this presentation, right? Because I've tried to knock on doors, and it doesn't always work. So all of this is to say, if you have friends at other communities, other parishes, churches, even secular organizations who you think might, be an audience, please ask them, okay? I haven't yet booked our date for, what's the other, we were talking about this last time, the other Presbyterian church in Buckhead, right off of Peachtree, right off of Peachtree. Covenant, yeah. So Covenant reached out to me and asked me to come in, and I mentioned to them that I'm teaching this class here, and they said, oh, I love that place. So they know, of course, your leaders here in the community. So anyway, it's kind of word of mouth. So as much as you can get the message out, please do. Okay, I need your help. All right, thank you. Hi.
I'm Patrick Day. I'm one of the pastors here. If I'm being honest, I wanted to walk out, not out of protest, but just because it is so much.
It is so much. Yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for putting this together. And hope to continue the conversation. So I won't take any more time. But again, just to say thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Yeah. All right.
Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, guys. We'll end on there.